Master, members of the livery, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure to be here, not least because I have known your new master for a long time and honour him enormously and think you're extremely lucky to have him. And I think you think so too. But I'm also particularly pleased because it is pattern makers. And I want to suggest in an unusual way that you are the livery company most important when we come to deal with my particular subject, which is climate change. Because there you were in the early days when the city was becoming larger and the numbers of people more, and the mess and the dirt and the rest of it getting worse. And you were the people who managed to provide what I would call something to provide adjustments to deal with the weather. That's what you did. And I must say, coming from Suffolk as I do, when it hasn't stopped raining for 3 months, patterns would be very helpful indeed. And the truth is that you, as a livery company, are the present inheritors of people who looked at the way the world was moving and found ways to deal with the problems. The thing that I find most difficult today is the number of people who don't see how the world is moving and therefore aren't prepared to deal with the problems. Truth should be at the centre of the way in which we proceed. We have to recognise what is true. I've been a businessman all my life, except for the period of time when I was a minister. And so apart from those 16 years, I have always been involved in business. And the thing I know most about business is that what we need is certainty. What is most difficult is uncertainty. And of course, uncertainty is endemic. We always have uncertainties. So we have to concentrate on those things that we know are really certain. And for me, the thing that is most certain is that climate change is going to get worse. And we better face up to it. And if we're running businesses, if we don't face up to it, then we're not going to make any money. I'm also a vulgar capitalist. I believe that in the end, you have to explain to people how you find the way of making profits, because only that will pay for all the things that we need. And if that's the case, then for goodness sake, let's start off by recognising the certainty that the filthy weather this year will be worse, if not next year, certainly the year afterwards. So we may as well accept that and stop complaining, just like the pattern makers in the first place. They didn't say, well, we're waiting for the city to clean up the streets. They didn't say we want someone else to do something about it. What they did was to say, well, if you put these things on the bottom of your shoes, you can get past. And I think about you all the time because I live in a house in Westminster where the hall is wider than later halls. And I know why that was, because at the end of the street is the pub called the Two Chairmen. And what would happen would be that Milady's servant would go along and the two chairmen would come and carry the sedan chair into the house, which is why the hall is so wide, in order that Milady didn't get her feet dirty, because she was stupid enough not to have pattens. She wouldn't get her feet dirty as she left and went on her way. Now, the reason I talk about that history is that if you look back at the history of business in Britain, what you discover is very simple, that the people who have made money are the people who have faced the facts. And they haven't pretended. They've said, this is what's happening, and we are going to find a way through. And that is where the future lies. And I was so pleased to listen to so charming a spokesman for your livery company in proposing the toast for the guests. It shows that you are alive and young and diverse. All that is very important. But we won't actually meet the needs of the next generation or the diversity which we should be proud to accept if we don't recognise the truth that we have now to act in two different ways. The first is your way. The first is dealing with adjustment, sorting out how we live with the changes which are going to happen, whatever we think, because they're in the system. Nothing we're going to stop that. We know that for the next 50 years, the changes will be very significant, and we've got to sort that out. So people have got to face the fact that my village, which has been flooded for the first time for 1,000 years, will be flooded more often. And the city has got to think very seriously about the future of insurance, because more and more we are not in the same area that we have been before. And not only insurance, but reinsurance too, because you can't spread it like you used to, because climate change is affecting nations throughout the world. Some parts of America have had no winter, because that is the situation that climate change brings about. I was appalled to read that Spain had a temperature of 30 degrees centigrade actually in January. They've never experienced that before. We used to get all sorts of lettuces and other salads and soft fruit from Spain. They can't produce it now because they haven't got the water. There are 2 rivers in Spain which no longer reach the sea because the water isn't there. You've all read about what's happened in the Panama Canal, that there isn't enough water to let the boats come through. Now, I say that because I've got to remind people of it. When we have the ridiculous comment by Jacob Rees-Mogg today to say we don't need to do these things, we can put them all off. It is the most dangerous statements that we can make. You, in your tradition, can do a great deal to help us to live with what we've landed with, because that's what pattern makers do. But I hope you'll also help us to change the world so that we live in a cleaner, better world. Fighting climate change isn't to make a worse world. How is it that we allow hundreds of children to die in London because the air is so filthy? How is it that we accept that and don't make the changes that we ought to make? How is it that in this country of ours we have lost more biodiversity than any other country in the world over the last 20 years? How is it that we have allowed agriculture to move from what was a real contributor to a situation in which they're poisoning the very land which they need to produce harvests in the future? I say that, I admit I am a small farmer. We are an organic farm, and we produce animals because you need animals as well as plants. So anybody here who's a vegan, come and talk to me afterwards, because you just have to realize we need both. And we need to find a way of living in the way that in many ways our great-grandparents did, which was the balance of nature, accepting that we were part of it, and living in a way which respects the soil and respects what we produce. And therefore, I end with coming back to where I began. The pleasure of coming here is because in your new master, you have someone who in the City of London is standing for precisely these principles. And I want people really to think for a moment, not about the world, not even about Britain, but about themselves and their children and grandchildren, and if they haven't got it, their nephews and nieces, and say to themselves, how am I going to look in the eyes of those children if I don't get this right? I don't want to have to excuse this generation, because we know, and if you know, you are responsible. That's the lesson of Genesis. That's what happened in the garden. When people knew, had eaten the apple, they could no longer live in ignorance. We know. And if we don't take responsibility for fighting the issue of climate change, then we are not deserving of the respect of our children and grandchildren. We can't make up for the fact that we and our parents and grandparents have brought us to this stage. But we can change the world now. And the world which we will produce will provide jobs, will provide profits, and will make life better for people. If we can explain to them that, instead of moaning on, if we can explain to them that, then they will understand why it is that we want now to do those two things: the historic pattern maker's job of living with what we have, making it possible to accept what has already happened, and the new job, which is to change the world sufficiently so that there is a future, and a better future, and a cleaner future, not only for ourselves, but for our children and grandchildren. I now ask you to rise and drink a toast, bearing in mind that this means that the pattern makers are going to carry out their historic duty to drink a toast to the master and the pattern makers' company.